Today I'm reviewing a book called Sideshow, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Destruction of Cambodia by William Shawcross. Now there is a lot to talk about in this book, so let's see if we can get through as much as we can. The camera I am currently using has a limit of 30 minutes on the file size. So if I'm still talking at 30 minutes, the camera is just automatically going to cut me off. So that's the time limit I'm going to operate under. For most normal people, this would be no problem, but I tend to ramble a lot, and routinely in my videos, I have trouble making it under 30 minutes. But I'm going to try and talk as fast as I can, explain as much as I can, and we'll just see how much we can get through before my time is up. The other thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try and give as much background as possible, because if there's one thing I've discovered here on BookTube over the years, it's that you can't really assume background knowledge on anything. There's somebody watching from somewhere who doesn't know the history behind any of this. It's just the nature of the internet. So I'm going to try to explain all the necessary background information and get through all the interesting stuff in the book as best I can. Here we go. During the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. fought a war against communist forces in Southeast Asia, primarily in Vietnam, but also less well known in Laos and Cambodia. It's called the Vietnam War, but Laos and the insurgencies in Laos and Cambodia were like the sideshows. The war was unsuccessful, and all three countries ended up, the communist insurgents were victorious. Now, in Cambodia in particular, the communists who won were known as the Khmer Rouge. Khmer means Cambodian. It's like the Cambodian word for Cambodia. Rouge is French, meaning red. It was a former French colony, so the communist insurgents were named the Red Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge. And they ended up being particularly brutal. They presided over some of the worst atrocities and mass murders of the 20th century. Particularly the killing fields, where a lot of Cambodians were murdered or executed, torture chambers, prisons, a lot of atrocities committed under the Khmer Rouge. Now, during the war, the Vietnam War, as the war dragged out in the U.S., there were people who were anti-war, wanted to stop the war, and people who were pro-war. This tended to fall out along political lines. So the pro-war was mostly the conservatives, the right-wingers, and the anti-war tended to be the liberals and the leftists. So, when the war was unsuccessful and these vicious atrocities started coming out of Cambodia, it was common, well, maybe not common, but there was some people blamed the anti-war liberals and leftists for this. You were the guys who gave up on the war, and as a result, these great atrocities ended up being committed by the communists. Now, William Shawcross, in his book, offers somewhat of a counter-analysis to this narrative. I'm not sure whether or not he's the first person to come up with this counter-narrative, but definitely the most prominent. So Shawcross argues that actually the victory of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was completely the fault of Kissinger and Nixon, because if Kissinger and Nixon would have just left Cambodia alone, Cambodia would never have descended into civil war, and the Khmer Rouge would never have won. So there was a king of Cambodia, King Sihanouk, who was doing his best to keep Cambodia neutral and keep Cambodia out of the war. And if he had just been allowed to keep doing what he was doing, the communist insurgency in Cambodia was very marginal at the beginning of the 1970s. And it's because Cambodia became destabilized as a result of Nixon and Kissinger's intervention that allowed this communist insurgency to grow and allowed the communist insurgency to be victorious, and subsequently all of the atrocities that were committed by the communist insurgency can be blamed on Nixon and Kissinger, indirectly at least. Not to mention the massive bombing campaign which Nixon and Kissinger directed against Cambodia, which also led to a lot of death and destruction, and the destruction of Cambodia. So that's Shawcross's analysis in a nutshell, and I'll get around to explaining more of that in detail as we go through it, but that's the overall picture here. This book was originally published in 1979. It was republished in 1986 with some additional information, and also an afterword in which Shawcross publishes some additional material, which includes a back and forth between him and some of Kissinger's supporters, which occurred in the American Spectator after the publication of the first edition. It has been regarded as a classic among leftist and liberal circles for many years. I remember hearing about this book on college campus in the 1990s and hanging out in activist circles in the early 2000s. I'm not sure if people still talk about this book. You know, I'm a bit out of touch, having been outside of the US for so many years. But, I mean, let me know in the comments what your experience of this book is. Have you heard about it? When did you hear about it? How did you hear about it? Now, interestingly enough, even though this book is a classic in leftist circles, the author himself, William Shawcross, is not really a doctrinaire leftist. He's a British journalist. Even back when this book was published, or around the time it was published, a few years after, he published a book in 1983 called The Quality of Mercy, which was about the Western responses to the atrocities in Cambodia, which, full disclosure, I've not read that book, but I'm familiar with it by reputation. And he criticized a lot of leftist intellectuals for either their support of the Khmer Rouge or their failure to condemn it. Most notably Noam Chomsky, who's a famous leftist intellectual in the United States, somebody I've talked about on this channel several times before. As the years went by, Shawcross became more and more conservative to the point where he was actually supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yeah, it's a classic book in leftist circles, written by somebody who I guess you would no longer call a leftist, but there you go. Shawcross is a journalist by trade, and this book reads in a large part like something a journalist would write. And what I mean by that is he interviewed lots of people for this book. According to Wikipedia, he interviewed 300 people. And from these interviews, he's able to reconstruct a lot of scenes. So the book, I mean, as I mentioned in my description of the book, it's about one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. So it's depressing reading in many ways. It's a very depressing subject, but at the same time, it's just so fascinating and just so interesting because Shawcross takes you into the rooms. Not the whole book, but certainly large parts of it read like a narrative. So you're reading this and you're reading these descriptions of discussions that happen in the White House or at the U.S. Embassy in Cambodia, and you're like, how does he know this? Was he there? And when you're reading the book, it's not always clear where he got the information from. It's not like sourced like this is from this conversation or this is from this interview. Or if it is, I don't remember at the very least. But yeah, according to Wikipedia, he interviewed 300 people, and so that's the background for all this information. And so before I get into the political analysis of this, I just want to highlight how interesting, in terms of like a narrative quality, some of these little details are. So there's a lot to choose from. I'll just do a couple representative ones. One incident, which I thought was a very good narrative incident, was during the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. There was a guy named William Watts who was chosen to coordinate the National Security Council work on the invasion of Cambodia. He opposed the invasion of Cambodia, so he went into Kissinger's office and he said, I can't work on this because I oppose this policy. Kissinger said to him, your views represent the cowardice of the Eastern establishment. Now, William Watts, who was under a lot of stress because of the whole week at that point, just snapped. And he started walking stridently towards Kissinger. Kissinger could see that this guy had aggression in his eyes, and Kissinger retreated behind his desk. And so once Watts saw Kissinger retreat behind his desk, he just stormed out and went to write his resignation letter, where he was confronted by Alexander Haig, who was the chief of staff, I believe, under the Nixon administration. And Alexander Haig was a big supporter of this policy. So Alexander Haig said, what are you doing? You can't resign. Your commander-in-chief just gave you an order. And William Watts replied, fuck you, Al. I just did. And you read that and you're like, that's a brilliant little narrative. How did Shawcross get this information? And again, I guess it comes from the 300 people he interviewed and how he was able to put all these scenes together. And there are tons of them. Not just on the U.S. side, on the Cambodian side, describing the various rivalries between the members of the Khmer Rouge coalition and King Sihanouk's offices. There's a lot of interesting personalities which come through in this book, is what I'm saying. And so, although one hates to talk about a book with such a heavy subject matter as interesting, it's really interesting. You go into this book expecting the heavy polemic and, kind of a feel-bad book about what the United States did to Cambodia. And it is. But it's also just a fascinating book that takes you behind the scenes of a lot of this. That being said, there were some parts of the book that bored me, if I'm going to be a little bit frank. Not the whole thing, but some parts of it. So for example, near the beginning of the book, there's some description about how Nixon and Kissinger were trying to extend the power of the executive branch by trying to outmaneuver the State Department and the Defense Department. And there is a surprising amount of detail about the bureaucratic maneuvering that they did to kind of restructure things so that they were able to get around these departments. And it's important information, it's necessary information, it's information that's I'm sure very important for every history student. But reading about it in the detail that Shawcross goes into made me feel a little bit bored, which is not to say I think he should have cut it out. It should be in there. I'm just kind of giving a forewarning to any potential reader. Some parts of the book are a little bit of a slog, but stick it out because it'll, I promise you, it will get very interesting again. I mean, depressing, but interesting. Okay. Now, as promised, let me try and summarize Shawcross's analysis. Let me give a little caveat here by saying that my summary is not going to do justice to it. If you want to get his whole analysis, read the book. He goes into a lot of detail on all of this, but I'm just going to try and briefly summarize what his main points are. So, as I said before, Shawcross believes that if the U.S. would have just stayed out of Cambodia, King Sihanouk would have been able to keep the country stable and there was a communist insurgency in Cambodia, but it was marginal, according to Shawcross. It was he calls it a Maquis, a small Maquis faction, kind of up in the provinces. The problem was the North Vietnamese were traveling through Cambodia to get into South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong as well. because the U.S. was so heavily bombing Vietnam. So this was a way to escape the U.S. bombs, is to go through Cambodia. King Sihanouk wasn't happy about it, but Cambodia was a very weak and very politically unstable country, or inefficient. The government wasn't working all that well. So there wasn't really much Sihanouk could do about it. And the North Vietnamese kind of promised him, in return for him turning a blind eye to it, that they would not do anything to aid the communist insurgency in his own country. Now the U.S. Started to bomb Cambodia very early on, but I think the major bombing started in 1969. Now, the 1969 bombings are kind of infamous in the history of presidential overreach, because these were secret bombings and most probably illegal bombings. So Nixon and Kissinger did not want the American public finding out that we were bombing Cambodia at the time. This was a time when sentiment was turning against the war in the United States. So there were a lot of effort putting into keeping these bombing secrets, to the point where the pilots would fly up in the sky, and then they would get their new coordinates once they were already en route, so that there was no record that they were getting the coordinates to bomb Cambodia. Now, there's a little bit of conflicting information about whether or not Sihanouk approved this. I guess maybe he kind of approved the U.S. bombings, but he didn't really have a choice. He couldn't have said no even if he wanted to. He was too weak to resist it. And when these bombings became public knowledge and the U.S. public found out about it, it was secret bombings. I think the congressional leaders were told about it, but not the Congress as a whole. The American public certainly wasn't told about it. The congressional leaders were told that they legally had to keep it secret. They could not tell anyone else, and they obliged that. I'm not sure if that would have happened nowadays, but they did that then. Anyways, when the American public found out about it, of course, there was a huge outrage, and it was argued by Nixon, Kissinger, and their supporters that it was perfectly legal because Sihanouk had approved it. And then one of the judges had to remind the Nixon administration that King Sihanouk could not give them the authority to circumvent the American Constitution. You know, King Sihanouk could have approved it or he could not have approved it, but in the American Constitution, Congress approves the war and the war funding. So, that was an example of illegal presidential overreach, is the secret bombing of Cambodia. But the secret bombing of Cambodia is vastly overshadowed by the not secret bombing of Cambodia, the open bombing of Cambodia, which occurred all during the early 1970s, as well as the U.S. invasion into Cambodia. So the U.S. invaded Cambodia in 1970, again to fight the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, who were using Cambodia as both a base to escape from the U.S. bombing and as a way to get around the U.S. bombing into South Vietnam. Now, the problem with invading Cambodia from the Cambodian point of view is when the U.S. invaded, it just pushed the North Vietnamese further back into Cambodian territory, and so increased the destabilization of Cambodia. And there's a great passage in the book, let me see if I can find it, which details the conversation that went on between Lon Nol, then the head of Cambodia at the time, and Alexander Haig, who was explaining this to them. And this again goes to what I was saying before about how William Shawcross has just compiled all this narrative of conversation. So Lon Nol is saying to him, he's saying, we need the U.S. Army to help contain the North Vietnamese that you're pushing further into our country. And Alexander Haig listens to Lon Nol's concerns, and then Alexander Haig responds by saying, actually, the U.S. is limiting our presence in Cambodia. We're going to be withdrawing, and we're only going to be offering air support and financial aid after that. And Lon Nol is realizing the impact of what Alexander Haig is saying. And he just bursts into tears because he realizes his country is going to be destroyed. And the book describes him as turning around so Alexander Haig can't see him weeping, and say, oh, my country is going to be destroyed. That's the other part of the analysis. Then, I already talked about Lon Nol previously. Lon Nol came to power as a result of a coup in 1970. Previously, King Sihanouk had been president. Sihanouk was accused of being a little bit too cozy with the leftist elements, and also being a little bit resistant to the U.S. forces. I mean, he let the U.S. bomb Cambodia, allegedly, but he was reluctant to give the U.S. full authorization to do whatever they wanted in Cambodia. So there was a coup staged by Lon Nol, which removed Sihanouk from power. Now, it's been a source of speculation ever since how much the U.S. is behind this. And of course, if you know your U.S. history, you know during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the CIA and the U.S. government was behind any number of coups. That being said, Shawcross examines all the evidence in his book and comes to the conclusion that there's no evidence that the U.S. was behind this coup. It looks a little bit suspicious. He says maybe in the future more evidence will come to light. He wrote that back in 1979. Since that time, I don't believe any new evidence has come to light, so I myself would judge it probable that the U.S. was not involved in that coup. But what Shawcross does allege is that the United States could have reversed it once it realized what was going on. The United States could have exerted its pressure to stop the coup and reinstate Sihanouk. Instead, the United States government did the opposite. It recognized the Lon Nol government and helped to solidify the coup. So this further destabilized Cambodia regime. First of all, because King Sihanouk, after he had been deposed, threw in his lot with the Khmer Rouge. King Sihanouk entered into a coalition with the Khmer Rouge communist insurgents. And King Sihanouk was, because of the conservative Cambodian countryside, King Sihanouk was deified as a god king by the Cambodian peasants. And so when he went over to the Khmer Rouge, they went from like an insignificant small insurgency to like a major political force. So vastly inflated their political capital and their numbers. As well as Lon Nol instituted a very corrupt regime. Now, there had been some corruption before with King Sihanouk. If you know anything about Cambodia or its history, you know Cambodia has a problem with corruption. It's something that goes all through Cambodian history, and it's still a problem today. But anyways, but it was particularly bad under Lon Nol. And the U.S. government was trying to prop up the Lon Nol fight against the communists. It was flooding it with money and arms, which just encouraged the corruption. Lon Nol's officers couldn't handle all this money. It just made them more corrupt. They couldn't resist the temptation. And even worse, a number of them were making accommodations with the Khmer Rouge. So they were getting these weapons from the U.S. government and then selling them to the Khmer Rouge, or funneling money or weapons to the Khmer Rouge. So it was just a very unstable situation. And then there was the bombing. the massive, massive bombing. Now, something that I'm an American, something that doesn't get talked about often in American history classes is just how much we bombed Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. So there was Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, each of which was just massively, massively bombed. So a statistic I learned when I took a college course on early American history back in my college days is that the Americans dropped more tons of bombs, more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam than was dropped during World War II for the entirety of World War II by all sides. So if you combine all the tons of bombs that were dropped in World War II by everybody, by all the Axis powers and by all the Allies powers over the entirety of World War II, including the tonnage of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more bombs were dropped on Vietnam. That's just Vietnam. Cambodia, I've gotten a little bit of conflicting statistics on this. I believe the Lonely Planet gives the same statistic for Cambodia. So more bombs were dropped on Cambodia than in all of World War II. Other sources I've seen says that for Cambodia, the statistic is more tonnage of bombs was dropped on Cambodia than was dropped by all the Allied powers in World War II. So not all the sides combined, but just all the Allied powers. Including the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's, but Cambodia is a small country. So that's just on Cambodia. Just during those 5 years, more bombs were dropped in Cambodia than all the all the bombs dropped by all the Allied powers during World War II. Shawcross talks about what was driving these bombs. And he says it wasn't because of military necessity. It was because of inter-service rivalry in the Air Force. So there are various generals. Each general wanted to make sure his planes were up flying these sorties. So it became politically very difficult to decrease the bombing just because the generals wanted to keep their planes flying. And he calls this the fire hose principle, or he quotes from other people who call it the fire hose principle. So a fire hose, when you're there's imagine there's a fire and the firemen have the fire hose. You can't actually increase or decrease the pressure of the fire hose. The fire hose is just ongoing full blast. You can move it, so you can change the direction of it, but you can never decrease the amount of the pressure of the water coming out. So this apparently was analogous to the U.S. bombings during this period. The bombs just, the planes had to be flown, the sorties had to be conducted, the bombs had to be dropped so you could redirect them. So for example, when there was peace talks with North Vietnam in 1968, those planes were redirected into Laos, but you couldn't get the planes to not bomb. They had to be out there bombing somebody. And Shawcross describes the efforts of, so who was it? Lard, who was one of the, Secretary of Defense Melvin Lard was trying to cut back on the amount of bombing in Cambodia because he said it was just completely without military necessity. And he ended up losing this battle. Kissinger refused to cut down on it and said all the sorties and tactical strikes and the B-52 bombers that had already been approved for the next fiscal year would fly regardless of the military situation. And Lard said, well, if you're talking just about the bombing in terms of the number of sorties, regardless of the military situation on the ground, you aren't even qualified to discuss the problem. But Lard lost that battle. And so not only was this a war crime, bombing these targets not for a military reason, just wanton destruction, but Shawcross alleges that these atrocities destroyed the psyche of the Cambodians. And so that the reason that the Khmer Rouge was so brutal when they came to power is because they had been so brutalized during this war. They had been bombed out of their minds. There were only a few survivors left out of the insurgency. I'm out of time. I'm going to have to stop here.